Hello and welcome to the Reformed Rogue reading of Civilization on Trial by Arnold Toynbee. We are picking up where we last left off in Chapter 7, The International Outlook. When I compare the aftermaths of the two wars, I see a number of obvious resemblances, but one outstanding difference. Last time, we believed that the War of 1914 to 1918 had been a terrible but nevertheless non-significant interruption in the course of reasonable civilized historical progress. We thought of it as an accident, like a railway collision or an earthquake, and we imagined that, as soon as we had buried the dead and cleared up the wreckage, we could go back to living the comfortable, uneventful life which at that time had come to be taken for granted, as though it were the birthright of man by that small, exceptionally privileged fraction of the living generation of mankind that was represented by people of the middle class in the democratic industrial Western countries. This time, by contrast, we are well aware that the end of hostilities is not the end of the story. What is the issue that is arousing this anxiety today all over the world, among the Americans, the Canadians, ourselves, our European neighbors, and the Russians? Or from the glimpse of the Russians that I had at Paris this last summer, I should say that we can gauge the Russians' feelings pretty accurately by analogy with our own. I shall give you my own personal view, which is, as you will see, a controversial one. My personal belief is that this formidable issue is a political issue, not an economic one, and I further believe that it is not the question whether the world is going to be unified politically in the near future. I believe, and this is, I suppose, my most controversial assertion, but I am simply stating what I do sincerely think. I believe it is a foregone conclusion that the world is in any event going to be unified politically in the near future. If you consider just two things, the degree of our present interdependence and the deadliness of our present weapons, and put these two considerations together, I do not see how you can arrive at any other conclusion. I think the big and really formidable political issue today is not whether the world is going to be unified politically, but in which of the two alternative possible ways this rapid unification is going to come about. There is the old-fashioned and unpleasantly familiar way of continual rounds of wars going on to a bitter end at which one surviving great power knocks out its last remaining competitor and imposes peace on the world by conquest. This is the way in which the Greco-Roman world was forcibly united by Rome in the last century BC, and the Far Eastern world in the 3rd century BC by the Roman-minded Principality of VII. And then there is the new experiment in a cooperative government of the world. No, not quite a new one, because there were abortive attempts at finding a cooperative way out of the troubles that were actually brought to an end by the forcible imposition of the Pax Romana and the Pax Sinica. But our own pursuit, in our own lifetime, of this happier solution has been so much more resolute and so much more self-conscious that we may perhaps fairly regard it as a new departure. Our first attempt at it was the League of Nations. Our second attempt is the United Nations Organization. It is evident that we are engaged here on a very difficult political pioneering enterprise over largely unknown ground. If this enterprise did succeed, even if only just so far as to save us from a repetition of the knockout blow, it might open out quite new prospects for mankind, prospects that we have never sighted before during these last 5,000 or 6,000 years that have seen us making a number of attempts at civilization. After greeting this gleam of hope on our horizon, we should be sinking into a fool's paradise if we did not also take note of the length and the roughness of the road that lies between our goal and the point at which we stand today. We are not we are not likely to succeed in averting the knockout blow unless we take due account of the circumstances that unfortunately tell in favor of it. The first of these adverse circumstances with which we have to contend is the fact that within the span of a single lifetime, the number of great powers of the highest material caliber, if we measure this caliber in terms of sheer war potential, has dwindled from 8 to 2. Today, in the arena of naked power politics, the United States and the Soviet Union face one another alone. One more world war, and there might be only a solitary great power left to give the world its political unity by the old-fashioned method of the conqueror imposing his fiat. This startlingly rapid fall in the number of great powers of the highest material caliber has been due to a sudden jump in the material scale of life, which has dwarfed the powers of the dimensions of Great Britain and France by comparison with the powers of the dimensions of the Soviet Union and the United States. Such sudden jumps have occurred before in history. Between 500 and 400 years ago, powers of the dimensions of Venice and Florence were similarly dwarfed by the sudden emergence of powers of the dimensions of England and France. This dwarfing of the European powers by the United States and the Soviet Union would have happened, no doubt, in any case in course of time. It is, I should say, an inevitable ultimate consequence of the recent opening up of the vast spaces of North America and Russia, and of the still more recent development of their resources by application there, on a massive scale, of technical methods partly invented in the laboratories of Western Europe. But the time taken by this inevitable process might have been as much as 100 years if it had not been telescoped into a third or a quarter of that span, by the cumulative effect of 2 world wars. If the change had not been thus accelerated, it would have been a gradual process that might have allowed all parties time to adjust themselves to it more or less painlessly. As a result of its having been speeded up by the 2 wars, it has been a revolutionary process which has put all parties in a quandary. It is important for European observers to realize, as one does realize when he has been watching the reactions in the United States at first hand, that this speeding up of the transfer of material power from the older powers of the inner ring in Europe to the younger powers of the outer ring in America and Asia is as awkward for the Americans as it is for ourselves. The Americans are homesick for their comparatively carefree 19th century past. At the same time, they realize far more clearly, and also far more generally, than either they or we realized after the War of 1914 to 1918, that it is impossible to put the clock back to a comfortable pre-war hour. They know that they have got to stay out in the world now, however much they may dislike the bleakness of the prospect. They are facing this unwelcome new chapter in their history with an unenthusiastic confidence when they think of it in terms of the technical and economic jobs that they will be called upon to do in Greece and Turkey and in other foreign countries that, as the president warned them, may follow. But they express something like dismay when they are reminded that man does not live by bread alone, and that they will have to take a hand in politics as well as economics if they are to succeed in acclimatizing democracy, in the Western meaning of the term, in non-Western countries where they are intervening for this purpose. Screen the political prisoners in Ruritania and see to it that the Ruritanian government releases those who ought to be at liberty, secure the transformation of the Ruritanian police from an agency for twisting the arms of the political opponents of the partisan government of the day into an agency for protecting the liberties of the subject, bring about a corresponding reform of the Ruritanian courts of justice. If you suggest to Americans today that once they have implicated themselves in Britannia, they will find it impossible to leave these political enterprises unattempted, they are apt to exclaim that the United States does not command the personnel for handling jobs of this kind abroad. This uneasiness about incurring political responsibilities in politically backward foreign countries has aroused in American minds a sudden concern about the future of the British Empire. This concern, like most human feelings on most occasions, is, I should say, partly self regarding and partly disinterested. The self regarding consideration in American minds is the prospect that, if the British Empire were to disintegrate, it would leave a huge political vacuum, far larger and more perilous than the no man's land in Greece and Turkey, into which the United States might find herself constrained to step in order to forestall the Soviet Union. The Americans have become alive to the convenience, for them, of the British Empire's existence, just at the moment when, as they see it, the British Empire is being liquidated. But this recently aroused American concern for the empire is also largely disinterested and warm-hearted. The traditional American denunciation of British imperialism went hand in hand, I fancy, with the unconscious assumption that this British Empire was, for good or evil, one of the world's established and abiding institutions. Now that the Americans really believe that the empire is in its death agony, they are beginning to regret the imminent disappearance of so prominent and familiar an object in their political landscape, and are becoming conscious of services performed by the empire for the world, which they did not value, and hardly noticed so long as they could take the continuance of those services for granted. This abrupt change in the American attitude towards the British Empire during the War of 1946 to 47 was the consequence of American interpretations of current events. At that time, two facts were striking the American imagination: the physical sufferings of the people of Great Britain and the definite decision of the government of the United Kingdom to withdraw from India in 1948. Taken together, these two facts made on American minds the impression that the British Empire was down and out, and, in their sensational way, American commentators telescoped a single instantaneous event into a single instantaneous event, the whole evolution of the British Empire since 1783, and at the same time assumed that the change had been wholly involuntary. As most Americans saw it, the United Kingdom had suddenly become too weak to hold the empire by force any longer. Few of them appeared to realize that the British people had learnt a tremendous lesson from the loss of the 13 colonies and had been trying to apply that lesson ever since. In uninstructed American minds, the impression was that the empire of King George III had existed practically unchanged till yesterday, and was suddenly crumbling today. And however wide of the mark it may seem to us to be, this American notion is not really so surprising as it must sound to British ears. On matters which do not happen to come within the range of our adult experience, all of us are apt to retain, uncriticized and unrevised, the crude and simple-minded conceptions that were suggested to us in childhood. There is, for instance, or used to be, till lately, a British schoolboy legend that the French have no capacity for governing dependencies or handling backward peoples. The average American's notion of the British Empire is similarly based on the legend of the Revolutionary War that he learned at school, and not on any first-hand grown-up observation of present facts. Many Americans, for instance, show ignorance even of the present status of Canada, though they themselves may be in constant personal contact with Canadians, and if they are, will have recognized them instinctively as being upstanding free people of the same kind as the Americans themselves. Yet, so far from putting two and two together and looking into the facts afresh, it is as likely as not that they will have gone on imagining that Canada in their lifetime is still being ruled from Downing Street and is paying taxes to which she never paid to the Treasury in Whitehall. This explains in large measure why both the speed and the character of the change that has taken place in the constitution of the British Empire have been misconceived by many American minds. Yet, when all due correction of such misconceptions has been made, the British critic has, in his turn, to face the fact that in the power of the empire, as distinct from its constitution, a change has taken place that has not only very great, but also that has been not only very great, but also very rapid. The truth is that in terms of pure power politics, of sheer war potential, there are now only two great powers left confronting one another: the United States and the Soviet Union. The recognition of this fact in the United States explains the heart searching caused by the announcement of the Truman Doctrine. Americans realized that this is a turning point in American history for two reasons. In the first place, it brings the United States right out of her traditional isolation, and in the second place, the president's move might turn out, however far this may have been from his intention, to have given the whole course of international affairs an impulsion away from the new cooperative method of trying to achieve political world unity, and towards the old-fashioned method of fighting out the last round in the struggle of power politics and arriving at the political unification of the world by the main force of a knockout blow. Having now reviewed the circumstances that tell in favor of this old-fashioned solution, we must arouse ourselves to get better of them by reminding ourselves how utterly disastrous a knockout blow would be. It would condemn mankind to go through at least one more world war. A third world war would be fought with atomic and perhaps not less deadly new weapons. Moreover, in previous cases, for example, the forcible unification of the Chinese world by the Principality of T'in and of the Greco-Roman world by Rome, the achievement of a long overdue political unification through a knockout blow has been purchased at the prohibitive price of inflicting mortal wounds on the society that has had unity imposed upon it by this extreme resort to force. If we thought of these wounds in material terms and tried to estimate the capacity of different civilizations for reconstruction as well as destruction, it might not be easy to draw up strictly comparable balance sheets for our modern Western civilization on the one hand and for the Greco-Roman and Chinese civilizations on the other. No doubt we have a far greater capacity to reconstruct as well as to destroy than the Chinese and the Romans had. On the other hand, a simpler social structure has a far greater spontaneous recuperative power than a more complicated one has. When I see our rebuilding program in Great Britain being retarded by shortages of skilled labor and of highly processed materials, and perhaps not least by the mere complication of the administrative machine, my mind goes back to a glimpse that I had in 1923 of a Turkish village reconstructing itself after it had been devastated in the last phase of the Greco-Turkish War of 1910 to 1922. Those Turkish villages were not dependent on materials or labor from outside, and they were not at the mercy of red tape. They were rebuilding their houses and replacing their household utensils and agricultural implements with their own hands, out of wood and clay within their reach. Who can estimate whether New York, after a Third World War, would fare materially as well as the Yeni Kui after 1922, or as badly as Carthage after 146 BC? The self-inflicted wounds from which civilizations die are not, however, those of a material order. In the past, at any rate, it has been the spiritual wounds that have proved incurable. And since beneath all the variety of cultures there is uniformity in man's spiritual nature, we may guess that the spiritual devastation produced by a knockout blow is of the same deadly degree of severity in every case. Yet, if the coercive method of attaining political world unity is measurably disastrous, the cooperative method, on its side, bristles with difficulties. At the present moment, for example, we can see the great powers trying, perhaps unavoidably, to do at the same time two things which are not only different, but which militate against one another all the time and are one another all the time and are quite incompatible in the long run. They are trying to launch a new system of cooperative world government without being able to forecast its chances of success, and they are safeguarding themselves against the possibility of its being a failure by continuing to maneuver against one another in the old fashioned way, in a game of power politics which, if persisted in, can only lead to a third world war and a knockout blow. The United Nations organization may fairly be described as a political machine for putting into effect the maximum possible amount of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two great powers who would be the principal antagonists in a final round of naked power politics. The present constitution of the UN represents the closest degree of cooperation that the United States and the Soviet Union can reach at present. This constitution is a very loose confederation, and the presiding genius of Chatham House, Lionel Curtis, has pointed out that political associations of this loose-knit type have never proved stable or lasting in the past. The United Nations organization after the World War of 1939 to 1945 is in the same stage as the United States after the War of Independence. In either case, during the war, a strong common fear of a dangerous common enemy held a loose association of states together. The existence of this common enemy was like a lifebelt keeping the association afloat. When the common enemy has been removed by defeat, the association that was launched on his account has to sink or swim without the unintended but most efficacious aid which the common enemy's existence provided. In such post-war circumstances, a loose confederation cannot long remain in its original state. Sooner or later, it must either break up or be transformed into a genuine and effective federation. A federation, in order to be a lasting success, seems to require a high degree of homogeneity between the constituent states. It is true that in Switzerland and in Canada, we see remarkable examples of effective federations that have successfully surmounted formidable differences of language and religion. But would any sober-minded observer today venture to name a date at which a federation between the United States and the Soviet Union might become practical politics? And those are the two states that have to be federated if federal union is to save us from a third world war. Yet, these obvious difficulties in the path of the cooperative method of working towards the inevitable goal of world unity must not daunt us, because this method brings with it certain unique benefits that no alternative can offer. It is only if there is some constitutional form of world government that powers can continue to count as great powers, and really to play that part, in spite of their war potential being no longer a match for the war potential of the Soviet Union and the United States. In an even partially constitutional world community, Great Britain, the constitutional West European countries, and the Dominions can still have an influence in international councils far in excess of the ratio of their war potential to that of the Big Two. In an even semi-parliamentary international forum, The political experience, maturity, and moderation of countries like these will weigh heavily in the balance alongside the grosser weight of Brennus' sword. In a pure power politics world, on the other hand, these highly civilized but materially less powerful states will count for nothing compared with the United States and the Soviet Union. In a Third World War, all of them, except perhaps South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, will be battlefields. This will be especially the fate of Great Britain and Canada, a prospect of which the Canadians as well as the English are well aware. As we look this dangerous situation in the face, some further questions suggest themselves. In politics, unlike personal relations, the saying that two is company, three is none is the very opposite of the truth. Where eight great powers, or even three great powers, can be gathered together, it is less difficult to manage a cooperative government of the world than where we can muster no more than two. This obvious reflection raises the question of whether it is possible to call into existence a third great power, which could be the peer of the United States and the Soviet Union on all planes, a match for each of them in terms of war potential in the arena of power politics, and their moral and political equal in the International Council chamber insofar as mankind succeeds in his present political pioneering enterprise of substituting the humane device of constitutional government for the blind play of physical force in the conduct of international relations. Could this role of a third great power in every sense, a role which the United Kingdom by itself no longer has the material strength to sustain, be filled by the British Commonwealth collectively? The short answer to this question is, I think, on a bare statistical test, yes. On a geographical and political test, no. In the councils of a constitutionally governed world, the states members of the Commonwealth will carry great weight because they are a large contingent in the small company of states that are politically mature, and also because they will be apt to speak with much the same voice, not because their policy will have been regimented, concerted, or even coordinated in advance, but because they have vitally important things in common in their political, social, and spiritual traditions, and have not ceased to live in unusually close and friendly relations with one another, since they have moved off on their separate roads towards the goal of self-government. But, in order to transform the Commonwealth into a third great power by making it as powerful collectively as its members are influential in the aggregate, the countries of the Commonwealth would have to weld themselves together into a massive military unity, as highly centralized as the Soviet Union is at all times, and as the United States is in time of war. And one has only to state this requirement in order to see that it is quite impracticable. It would mean reversing the direction in which the Commonwealth has been consistently and deliberately moving since 1783, and scrapping cumulative results of this evolution, which are the cherished joint achievements of the people of the United Kingdom and the peoples of the other countries in the Commonwealth that have attained self-government, on a par with the United Kingdom in the course of this last century and a half. One cannot have one's cake and eat it. One cannot put one's treasure in progressive devolution, aiming at a maximum of self-government in as many parts of the Commonwealth as may display or develop an aptitude for governing themselves, and at the same time expect to command the collective military strength which the government at Moscow, to take as an illustration the most pertinent case in point, has been consistently and deliberately building up for the last 6 centuries at the cost of liberty, variety, and other political and spiritual blessings which the Commonwealth countries have secured themselves at the cost of collective power. The Commonwealth countries cannot repudiate their ideals and unravel the web of history that they have woven for themselves. They would not do this if they could, and even if they could and would perform this left-handed miracle, they would have thrown away their birthright in vain. For, at however great a sacrifice of the Commonwealth's characteristic virtues and achievements, the Commonwealth could never be consolidated, either politically or geographically, to a degree that would make it a match for the United States or the Soviet Union in military power in terms of atomic warfare. In the game of power politics, a consolidated Commonwealth would still be a pawn, or at the most a knight, but never a queen. If the British Commonwealth cannot fill the role of the third great power in the world after the War of 1939 to 1945, could the part be played by a United States of Europe? This suggestion, too, wears a promising appearance at first sight, but in turn fails to stand the test of examination. Hitler once said that if Europe seriously wanted to be a power in the world in our time, and by power, of course, Hitler meant brute military strength, then Europe must be welcome and embrace the Führer's policy. And this hard saying was surely the truth. Hitler's Europe, a Europe forcibly united by German conquest and consolidated under German domination, is the only kind of Europe that could conceivably be a match in war potential for either the Soviet Union or the United States. And a Europe under German ascendancy is utterly abhorrent to all non-German Europeans. Some of them have been subjected to the appalling experience of German conquest and domination twice in one lifetime. Most of them have undergone it during the Second World War, and the handful that have escaped have been near enough to the fire and sufficiently scorched by its heat to share the feelings of those who have been burnt outright. In a European Union, excluding both the Soviet Union and the United States, and that hypothesis is the point of departure for trying to construct a European third great power. Germany must come to the top sooner or later by one means or another. And even if this united Europe were to be presented at the start with a Germany that was disarmed and decentralized, or even divided, in the realm that lies between the United States and the Soviet Union, Germany occupies a commanding central position. The German nation is half as numerous again as the next most numerous nation in Europe, the German inhabited heart of Europe, not reckoning in either Austria or the German-speaking part of Switzerland, contains a preponderant proportion of Europe's total resources in raw materials, plant, and human skill for heavy industry. And the Germans are as efficient in organizing both human and non-human raw materials for making war as they are inept in trying to govern themselves and intolerable as rulers of other people. On whatever terms Germany were to be included at the start in a united Europe that did not include either America or Russia, she would become the mistress of such a Europe in the long run. And even if the supremacy which she has failed to win by force in 2 wars were to come to her, this time, peacefully and gradually, no non-German European will believe that the Germans, once they have realized that this power was within their grasp, would have the wisdom or self-restraint to refrain from plying the whip and digging in the spurs. This German crux would appear to be an insurmountable obstacle to the construction of a European third great power. Nor in the world as it is today could a militarily consolidated Europe look forward with any more reasonable hope than a military consolidated British Commonwealth to make itself a match for the United States or the Soviet Union at the cost of sacrificing cherished liberties. In Western Europe especially, and Western Europe is the heart of Europe, the traditions of national individuality are so strong that the closest practicable European Union would be too loosely knit, to be more than a pawn in the power game, Even if this united Europe included the British Isles on the west and the countries now under Russian domination on the east, and even if the peoples of Europe as a whole tried their hardest to swallow Hitler's unpalatable gospel. Where then are we to find our third great power? If not in Europe and not in the British Commonwealth, then certainly not in China or India. For in spite of their ancient civilizations and their vast populations, territories, and resources, these two mammoths are most unlikely to prove able to exert their latent strength during the critical period of history that lies, we may guess, immediately ahead of us. We are driven to the conclusion that we cannot hope to ease the tensity of the present international situation by raising the number of powers of the highest military caliber through adding even one to the two that now confront one another. And this leads us to a final question. If we cannot see our way to any rapid attainment of the goal of world unity by constitutional cooperation, can we find the same way of postponing the terrible alternative of unification by force? Could two separate political worlds be delimited, one under the hegemony of the United States and the other under the domination of the Soviet Union? And if a demarcation line between them, encircling the globe, could be drawn without bringing the two great powers to blows, could an American world and a Russian world exist side by side, on the face of the same planet, for more than a short time without falling into war with one another? As, under different social and technological traditions, a Roman world and a Chinese world did once coexist for several centuries without war, and indeed almost without intercourse of any kind. If we could win time for peace by a provisional recourse to insulation, perhaps the social climates of the political universes on either side of the dividing line might gradually influence one another until they had become like enough to make it possible for the Soviet Union and the United States to enter, in an auspicious hour, into that effective political cooperation with one another that is at present beyond their reach by reason of the ideological and cultural gulf that now divides them. What prospects are there of the United States and the Soviet Unions practicing non-violent non-cooperation towards one another over a span of 30, 50, 100 years? If a dividing line could be drawn round the world, would that leave elbow room enough for each of them in her own sphere? The answer to our question would be an encouraging one if we could render it in economic terms alone. For each of these giants has ample economic elbow room, not only within its own sphere of influence, but within its own political frontiers. One of the considerations that drove the rulers of Nazi Germany and contemporary Japan into an aggressive war was their inability to provide more than a minority of their young men with jobs that satisfied their expectations, or even with jobs of any kind. By contrast, both Russia and America today have openings enough and to spare for the rising generation for as many years as anyone can see ahead. If man were nothing more than economic man, there would be no reason in the world why Russia and America should collide with one another for generations to come. But, unfortunately, man is a political as well as an economic animal. He has to contend not only with want, but with fear, and on the plane of ideas and ideologies, Russia and America cannot so easily avoid crossing each other's path by staying at home, and each cultivating her own ample garden. On this plane, the social climates of the two great powers will undoubtedly influence one another, but this mutual influence will not by any means necessarily be pacific in its effect, or lead towards reciprocal assimilation. It might alternatively produce a thunderstorm or an explosion. Neither the capitalist nor the communist world is immune against subversive influences radiating from the other. For neither of them is the earthly paradise that it claims to be, and they reveal their fears in the measures which each takes to protect itself against the other's radiation. The Iron Curtain with which the Soviet Union attempts to screen off the outer world tells its own tale eloquently. But on the capitalist side, there is a corresponding, though less paralyzing, fear of communist missionary activity. And while in democratic countries, this fear does not express itself in governmental bans on personal intercourse, it does very readily become inflamed into a panic stricken hysteria. Fear, then, might do what want could hardly do in causing Russia and America to fall foul of one another. But how, it might be asked, could this lead to an outright ordeal by battle between antagonists of such extremely unusual strength? The United States, with her immense superiority in industrial equipment, now capped by her monopoly of the know-how of the manufacture of the atom bomb, is so much stronger than the Soviet Union that, short of attempting to wrench out of her rival's grip, some country upon which the Soviet Union has already fastened its hold, is apparently possible today for the United States to assert her own protectorate over any country she chooses in the no man's land between the Soviet Union and herself, with little danger of the Soviet Union's attempting to oppose her by overt force. This is illustrated by the impunity with which the United States has been able to spread her aegis over Greece and Turkey, though these two countries lie on the very threshold of the approaches to the Soviet Union's principal granary and arsenal in the Ukraine and the Caucasus. This would mean that the United States has it in her power to draw the demarcation line between an American and a Russian sphere close round the present fringes of the Soviet Union's political domain. That would give the United States the lion's share of a partitioned globe, and this, so we might be inclined, on first thoughts, to conclude the argument, would augment America's already great preponderance over Russia, very notably. This conclusion, however, is one which second thoughts might revise. On such a division of the world, the preponderance of the United States would indeed be overwhelming statistically, but that, after all, is a theoretical and possibly misleading basis of comparison. In political, social, and ideological terms, would the ratio of strength be the same as in terms of area, population, and productivity? Could an American-led three-quarters or four-fifths of the world be so closely united in itself politically, socially, and ideologically as to be impervious to Russian missionary activity? Or, to put this last question the other way round, how far would the majority of the inhabitants of our hypothetical American sphere of influence be likely to be attracted to the present, rather conservative American gospel of out and out individualism? The present American ideology lays great stress on the value of freedom, but seems less keenly alive to the need for social justice. This is not at all surprising in an ideology that is a homegrown product, for in the United States today, the minimum standard of living is so extraordinarily high that there is not a crying need to curb the freedom of the able, the strong, and the rich in order to deal out a dole of elementary social justice to the incompetent, the weak, and the poor. But the material well-being of the people of the United States is, of course, something exceptional in the world as it is today. The overwhelming majority of the living generation of mankind, beginning with a foreign-born or foreign-descended underworld in the United States itself, and ending with a nearly 1,000 million Chinese and Indian peasants and coolies, is today underprivileged, and is becoming increasingly conscious of its plight and increasingly restive at it. In an unequally divided planet, the majority of this vast mass of primitive suffering humanity would be on the American side of the line, and to appreciate the utterly un American problems of this miserable flock would demand an almost superhumanly imaginative and benevolent sympathy on the part of their American shepherds. Here, for the American, would be his Achilles heel, and for the Russian, his opportunity to sow tares in his adversary's field. To look at the situation through Russian eyes, there might seem, in these circumstances, to be quite a promising prospect of at any rate partly redressing, by propaganda, a balance that had been upset by the American discovery of the know-how of the atom bomb. In a divided world in which the Americans had to fear the effects of Russian propaganda on vast non-American populations under the aegis of the United States, while the Soviet government, on its side, was terrified of the attraction which the capitalist way of life might have had for any Soviet citizens who came into personal contact with it, the prospects of stability and peace would evidently be unpromising if there were no other factor in the situation. Fortunately, a third factor, and a constructive one, would be provided by Great Britain and several of the continental West European countries. In this post-war chapter of history, these Western European countries are in an intermediate position between the United States and the overseas dominions of the British Commonwealth, on the one hand, and the politically and economic backward countries on the other. Post-war conditions in Western Europe are not so bad as to give the desperate remedies prescribed by communism that attraction for Englishmen, Dutchmen, Belgians, and Scandinavians that they might have had for the flagrantly underprivileged majority of Mexicans, Egyptians, Indians, and Chinese. But Western Europe is at the same time not so prosperous as to be able to afford the undiluted regime of private enterprise that still prevails in North America above the Rio Grande. In these circumstances, Great Britain and her West European neighbors are each trying to arrive at a working compromise suited to their own economic conditions here and now, and subject to modification in either direction as these conditions may change, for better or for worse, between unrestricted free enterprise and unlimited socialism. If these West European social experiments achieve any measure of success, they may prove a valuable contribution to the welfare of the world as a whole, not that they could serve as blueprints for automatic application elsewhere for the different peoples of the world who have suddenly been brought into close quarters with one another physically through the many inventions of the West, are still divided from one another politically, economically, socially, and psychologically by differences that it will take time to overcome. In a world in this stage of social evolution, a particular local and temporary solution of a worldwide problem cannot be applicable as it stands outside the country where it has been worked out by trial and error to fit the local conditions of the moment. But perhaps here we have put our finger on the service which the West European countries can perform for the world today. An awkward feature of the American ideology of free enterprise, as well as of the Russian ideology of communism, is precisely that it presents a social blueprint as a panacea for every conceivable social ill in every known set of social circumstances. But this does not fit the facts of real life. In real life, every social system that can be observed at first hand, or reconstructed from records, is a mixed system, lying at some point between the two theoretical poles of undiluted socialism and undiluted free enterprise. The statesman's task is to strike that note in the gamut that tunes in with the particular social circumstances of his time and place, to find the right mixture between free enterprise and socialism for driving his truck of state on the particular gradient on which it happens to be traveling at the moment. What the world needs above all now is to get the issue of free enterprise versus socialism off its ideological pedestal and to treat it not as a matter of semi-religious faith and fanaticism, but as a common sense, practical question of trial and error, of more or less circumstance and adaptation. If Western Europe could influence the rest of the world in this direction in the chapter of history ahead of us, that might be not only a great contribution to prosperity, but also a great service to peace. It might be one of the influences that would gradually break down the social, cultural, and ideological barriers between the United States and the Soviet Union. But, as has been suggested more than once in this paper, there has to be a minimum of constitutional cooperative government in the world to allow countries of the material caliber of the United Kingdom or the Netherlands to exercise influence in a world society in which, as a result of one of those changes in the scale of material life that overtake us from time to time, the only surviving great powers in terms of sheer war potential are giants of the tremendous caliber of the Soviet Union and the United States. Could this West European influence work in its beneficent unifying effect in a world unequally divided into an American and a Russian sphere? If it could, this might be a second line to fall back on if our second attempt at cooperative world government were to fail like the first. But it would, of course, be far better if the United Nations organization could be carried through to success, and this, I would suggest to you most earnestly, is the goal toward which we ought still to strive with all our might toward allowing ourselves to be dismayed or deterred by difficulties, however baffling, at a stage which is, after all, still a very early one in the United Nations' career.